We're going to have another full day today, but I'd like to begin with my normal retrospective to reflect a little bit on what we saw yesterday, and then talk a little bit about where we're going today. So yesterday we began a foray into the issue of cross-method modeling, with a discussion of trade-offs between different types of modeling approaches. And we had covered three types of modeling approaches, namely dynamic modeling approaches, namely system dynamics modeling, agent-based modeling, and discrete event modeling. And I began with some high-level comments on strengths of each of those approaches. You'll recall that system dynamics modeling was recommended by a very transparent type of representation. It has widely supported processes to involve stakeholders from very early in the process, and it's traditionally offered a very, very attractive package of that mixes together qualitative modeling in the form of causal loop diagrams with quantitative modeling in the form of fully quantitative stock and flow diagrams, and several mechanisms in between, such as the system structure diagram. These sort of artifacts make it particularly well suited to communicating with stakeholders from the very start of a modeling job, and can also be very helpful for sort of as persistent artifacts to keep one reminded of the scope of the model. They're very, very helpful, particularly when you're dealing with areas where you're not quite sure at a quantitative level how to approach things, and you want to sketch out aspects of sort of your understanding of the system early on in a way that will be broadly understandable. System dynamics also, conversely, is also amenable to formal analysis, which for some practitioners is a key asset and certainly allows a broad variety of tools to be used. By contrast, agent-based modeling really shines in a number of areas where system dynamics aggregate models suffer real challenges in representing large amounts of heterogeneity, in capturing aspects of situated context, where an individual's perception of the situation or their interactions, the choice set available to them, is significantly shaped by their position in a social network, shaped by their location in a geographic or spatial context. It's also very, very effective for dealing with situations where we particularly want to capture one aspect of heterogeneity, namely some aspect of a person's history, or where we wish to calibrate against data about that history, or otherwise make use of it in interventions. Agent-based modeling allows us a very fine-grained but very flexible lens to examine factors at an individual level that shape a person's evolution. It tends not to be that desirable when we have large quantities, such as the amount of water in a reservoir, which are not naturally amenable to individuation, to sort of distinction into quanta, into particular individuals. It's really focused at being able to characterize actors, as it were. Doing so at a multiple set of levels, which is very powerful. Those levels tend to be nested in agent-based models in a way that mirrors the world. But they do tend to, but if you're modeling something which involves a huge number of fairly homogeneous or interchangeable actors, mosquitoes, for example, or sea lice, in most cases, you tend to be very cautious about using something like agents to represent each of those because they're so interchangeable and the numbers are so high and the computational burden so large. By contrast, an aggregate model would be quite amenable to characterizing something like that. Agent-based models can be particularly powerful when capturing aspects of an individual's preferences and decision-making. So some of my colleagues, and I'd highlight, for example, Elizabeth Brooke, who's currently at University of Michigan, has defined her career in sort of characterizing people's decision-making strategies over time, whether it's in mate selection or aspects of choosing where to live, choosing how to interact with others online. There's a set of strategies she studies, and those strategies are based on an individual's perception of the situation, based on their experience and the limited amount that they know and can see. So if you're trying to capture aspects of social context, of social capital, aspects of how does people's decision making varies based on their preferences, and learning about those preferences, and in general capturing learning, agent-based modeling is a very powerful tool. It is, however, a somewhat it involves quite a bit of work to capture resource-limited processing of individuals through workflow, and there's a very natural tool for that in the form of discrete event modeling, discrete event simulation that we also introduced. This is the type of modeling that focuses around this issue of depicting workflows that are quite well defined, such as might obtain within certain industrial settings or within certain sub-areas of the healthcare system. Individuals who are called entities flow through that system. They are operated upon by processes, but their processing within a given process, a given stage of a process, is very often resource limited. So they can't get a workup from a clinician unless a procedure room is available. They can't undergo imaging for a possible broken bone until the X-ray is available, and until that time they wait in line. And resources can take many forms. Some of them are fixed resources like an MRI machine or a procedure room. Others of them are mobile resources. They can be moved around, a portable ultrasound, a gurney, a wheelchair. Others of them, in turn, are human resources. So things like a clinician or a nurse's assistant or a staff member who might be involved in servicing the MRI, a technician. So there are these different types of resources, and there's a big difference in discrete event modeling between the entities who flow through and the resources that operate upon them. This asymmetry can be very convenient for describing certain types of situations, but if you want to examine sort of more flexible interaction between patients and clinicians, you want to examine the triad that Jeff talks about between patients, the formal caregivers, and the informal caregivers. Think the family members who help sustain an individual's health, who help get that person to appointments, who help take care of their daily needs and activities of daily living, help check up on them and make sure they secure adherence to medication regimens and so on. If you want to depict that and its evolution over time, a discrete event model is not going to be amenable. Individual entities, those patients, for example, flow through that system, and they interact, for the most part, in one way. They keep each other waiting. They're not passing information to each other. They're not grousing to each other and complaining about the waits. They're not communicating knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, and norms to each other. That's outside the realm of typical discrete event modeling, and for that sort of interaction, we'd hybridize it with another type of modeling, agent-based modeling. And after we talked about some of these trade-offs, we went on to examine this issue of hybrid modeling. And before we actually built a model of that sort, I talked about 5 compelling cases where I see hybrid modeling conferring great value. And those cases ran the gamut from cases where we had a very detailed view of the population preceded by or followed by a very aggregate view, which is the example we ended up building. But also cases where, for example, an individual is depicted in the population as an agent, but they can present for care and flow through a care process as depicted by discrete event modeling. These different tools allow us to answer different questions very readily. And by combining a model with multiple techniques, I argued that first it allows you to secure benefits from each of those techniques in terms of their comparative advantages. So that's one big gain. And there are many types of comparative advantages, from computational efficiency to ease of expression of certain types of logic, to transparency to stakeholders, etc. But another type of advantage of hybrid modeling was the ability to change our lens adaptively as we learned during the modeling process. So modeling, I've argued from the first, from our opening presentation, is a matter of it's a learning tool. It's a tool that helps us learn more effectively. It's not a magic bullet. It's not a crystal ball. It doesn't tell us what is in the world, but it helps us spot more quickly inconsistencies between what we think might be and what's actually going on out there. So it helps us learn more quickly. And as such, it's very desirable to have a modeling methodology that allows you to change course in your modeling process as you learn in a modeling project. And so it is with hybrid modeling. It's one of the biggest things that represents it. So we will, in the course of a modeling project, sometimes expand the level of detail for a certain area, represent it in greater detail, and it behooves us to use a tool that will allow us to mix these different sorts of modeling together in that way. So that was hybrid modeling, and we actually built up a hybrid model that supported a coarser grained representation of an upstream population and then a finer grained representation of a downstream population. It also exposed you, for better or for worse, to the reality, perhaps one might say the harsh reality, of building models, that there is sometimes this code we have to create. And for those who are not from a background where they've been taught about computational tools and learned about coding, it's a little bit daunting to get started in this area. We saw just about the worst that we're going to be seeing in the week in that session, but it afforded us great strengths in capturing this hybrid model, and that code would pretty much be repeated boilerplate for other cases where we needed it, which is favorable. We then went on over lunch. You saw one example model and a description of sort of motivations behind it from Joachim Sternberg, our visitor from University of Newcastle in Australia, and from Dylan, who's been supporting him in building a model. And then we went on to build another model where we had interacting state charts. We had people whose state was depicted using different state charts. Before we did that, I forgot an important point. We discussed elements of the modeling vocabulary for agent-based modeling. And we noted that compared to system dynamics modeling, which is what Russians might call hedgehog knowledge, it knows just a few things really, really well, stocks and flows and their connection, and it uses them in very creative ways. Agent-based modeling is fox knowledge. It's knowledge of lots of different things, but any given model might only use a subset of them. And so we saw within the context of agent-based modeling in that presentation and in a subsequent model we built, we saw a cacophony of different types of constructs. We saw events. We saw state charts and transitions within state charts of multiple types. We saw rates and timeout transitions and arrival transitions and message transitions. We saw conditions that could be applied to either an event or a transition and trigger it. We also saw option lists, these things that encode different possibilities, categorical classifications. We saw the construct of a population which lives in Maine. We saw that population could be associated with statistics, which depict cross-sectional statistics calculated over the population. We saw that we could add to this many other features, variables that kept track of information as prosaic as color and as significant as, say, the number of people who have contracted a disease at one point or another. Within the context of agent-based modeling, we have at our avail a wide variety of these tools. And in that presentation before lunch, where I looked at the modeling vocabulary, we saw how it could be combined, for example, with networks, to put people in networks, something we'll be exploring more today because it links up many of the projects. And I want to show you how to put it into place. But we also saw that people could be associated with location. They could move around. They could contact each other. They could interact. And by interacting, things could happen. They could exchange norms or beliefs, or they could influence each other, or they could infect each other. The modeling vocabulary for agent-based modeling is pretty rich, pretty large. And you might build a model very easily, which abstracts away from spatial location, which has no movement of people over space. And that's perfectly fine. You might have a model which has no networks in it. All it has is people interacting by virtue of being nearby in space. There's no network represented. Conceivably, your model might use, if it's a hybrid model, maybe instead of state charts, much of the time it uses stocks and flows. That's fine to capture continuous state rather than sort of transition between different state categories. But all this brings us back at a certain level to that conceptualization exercise we did on the morning of Monday afternoon, where we were diagramming out features of a situation that might live within a person or lie outside a person. And we had drawn on that first day this kind of silhouette of a person, and we had represented a set of factors that are related to this person that govern factors of their evolution. And within that context, I had asked you to consider a set of different types of things. I'd ask you to consider parameters for the person, things that don't change much, that might encode things like someone's sex or ethnicity, perhaps for a shorter-term model, their income or what have you. So these parameters that might be relevant. Now, as we've seen in the past day, these parameters are in fact captured within any logic as constructs. They are not merely any old variable. They are a recognized construct. More than that, we can distinguish them in terms of subtypes, like whether they're a rate parameter, they're measured at something per unit time. But the point is that this parameter construct that I suggested that you think about that first day maps directly to what's supported within any logic. Another thing we talked about the first day was distinguishing state of a person. And further, actions which modify that state, which change their situation, and further, rules under which those actions apply, under which those actions are triggered. How do those three things relate to what we saw yesterday? How does it relate to what we've been working on in building models? Can anyone say, from the models we built yesterday, how did they capture state? How did they capture actions? How did they capture rules? Yes?
So you have the boxes for the state, and then the arrows between them were the actions, and then the formulas that you put in on the arrows were the rules.
Beautiful. Beautiful. You hit it exactly, at least for one of the two cases. That's exactly what's needed. So we have these state charts, and without prejudice, I'm drawing this as a linear state chart. Not to say it's mathematically linear; it may or may not be. But we have transitions. We might have a nonlinear state chart. We might have branches here. Someone gets infected with TB, and they either go on directly to primary TB or they develop latent TB. So we might have branching constructs or what have you. And within these state charts that we introduced, those simultaneously relate to the states of a person, the actions, and the rules. The states are the boxes, kind of the nouns. The actions are captured, the change of a person's state is captured by the transitions between them, just as Jacqueline said. The rules, the things that lead to that change, that trigger that change, are associated with the particulars of what we characterized in each of those transitions. So do you remember we had a timeout of a certain amount of time? That gives kind of a rule over which that transition will occur, that change will occur, that action will occur. Or we'll have a rate, and it says, with a certain rate of 1% per year, someone will develop heart disease in the absence of smoking. Or maybe it says, if you're a smoker, maybe we put in mechanisms so if you're a smoker, you're much more likely to develop heart disease. So there, the rule was a little bit more involved. It wasn't purely encoded only by the transition itself. There was this variable. Remember that? We remember we changed people's color by assigning to a variable, and we also changed their likelihood of developing heart disease by assigning to a variable. So those are aspects, those are sort of collectively implement a rule, which affects these actions. So one of the key ways we did this was, as Jacqueline said, through state charts. But there's another way, too. State charts are great for representing state that's categorical in nature. You are a never smoker, you're a current smoker, you're a former smoker. How if we had state like someone's weight, or someone's level of immune activation, or someone's level of stress, which might more naturally be captured as a continuous variable? What if we had that? What's another mechanism that simultaneously describes their state, how much of stress they have, how much allostatic load has been imposed on them, that describes the change in that over time and how that change is governed by other factors? What might we use to describe that? A system dynamics model, stocks and flows, right? Stocks and flows. So for continuous state, if we want to capture these three, which were things we actually drew in the diagram here, we could use state charts, and we can use stocks and flows. And in fact, as I browsed the findings in that first day, I actually saw a number of cases where people were using stocks and flows or were using state charts. So both of these mechanisms capture states, actions, rules, but in different ways. State charts more for categorical distinctions, discrete categories, and stocks and flows for continuous change. So that diagram we drew in the first day, again, maps fairly directly to any logic mechanisms. Now, it turns out I'm simplifying things. There are times where maybe we have continuous change, but we don't care to represent it. Maybe we have a continuous quantity, but we don't care to represent it using a stock and flow. Let me give an example of this. Maybe I'm capturing toxic stress, but I want to characterize at a level that doesn't focus on patterns, as Jeff indicated, system dynamics traditionally does with flows, sort of continuous processes, but rather I want to capture kind of moments of truth or episodes where stress occurs. Maybe stress has some element that builds up slowly, but there's a lot of things which might be episodic stressors, which might be events that happen. You know, I'm thrown out on the street because I've lost my job. I can't pay for my apartment, or I can't cover my medical bills, and I undergo a traumatic transition. I have a traumatic event, medical event, where, you know, I'm in a coma for 3 days because of a drug overdose. There might be events which lead to transitions in what is otherwise sort of a continuous quantity, stress levels or level of trust or what have you. So Jeff introduced me to the literature. Jeff is an unbelievably broad sort of grasp of literature. I have no idea how he does it. But one of the areas he introduced me to was his literature on moments of truth. These sort of sudden transitions that make all the difference in our subsequent trust or our subsequent relationships. The fact that even if there's a continuous quantity like stress or trust or weight or what have you, there may be discontinuous transitions that impact it. And in that case, we might not use a stock and flow diagram. We might actually use a variable and have it change through an event in the model. So I'm not saying they map always to these things. There's events that are sometimes used as well to capture these, to capture changes. But in general, what we saw yesterday in building up those models, both in the morning and afternoon, collectively can work to sort of capture features of this. There's time. Where do we capture time within any logic? Does anyone remember? So, sorry? Okay, so great. There was indeed in the project, there was a time unit. Do you remember that? And we could choose whether we want to classify time in seconds or years or minutes. And there was a discussion back and forth, which was a good one, about to what degree that's a kind of a convenience. It's just calling the yardstick a meter or calling it a kilometer for our convenience. And to what degree was it something meaningful? To what degree did it matter about what time unit we used? And I actually argued that in any logic, there actually is a calendar. There's a calendar of chronological time whereby you can ask it, for example, is this a holiday? Is this a weekend? Or is this is this a Monday or Tuesday or what have you? And if you want to make use of that, and it is useful for certain things, like health services delivery, is the clinic open or not at this time? Is the city hospital emergency room open? Or do you have to go to RUH here? This, if you want to use something like that, it can be useful to be, you want to be careful about what time unit you use. And in general, when we're building models, there's often time units which are natural for our modeling context, and we choose a modeling time unit accordingly. Now, any logic's natural unit of time, natural representation of time is continuous. Let's reflect on that, shall we not? So yesterday we saw we had events going off. When did we have an event in our model? Does anyone remember? I showed it in the vocabulary model, but when else did we have an event? Yeah, we created diabetic agents. So the event fired under certain condition. But in general, as I showed you for that model showing the vocabulary, events very commonly will fire at a certain time periodically. So every 1 year we'll do reporting on the number of patients in the sanitarium or what have you. for historic context. Or we'll have it fire at a certain rate, and a Poisson arrivals at a certain rate. It will fire off. For example, to represent immigrants arriving in the city, we'll create new people in the city when immigrants arrive. So those events are good, very useful. And we also saw transitions in state charts, how these could be fired off at any time. What you did not see is a prominent feature of most other agent-based modeling packages, to wit, time steps that are fixed in length. AnyLogic does provide that if you so wish. You make use of that, and there are places, and we actually saw them very briefly in one of the presentations, where you could stick those in, these so-called steps. But by and large, it makes use of a continuous time model. And what that means is that time is characterized however finely you want to create it. There might be a flurry of events here associated with some transition, some crisis that occurs. Maybe it's a medical episode. Maybe it's a case of a sudden transition in family dynamics. Kurt gets married, for example, and there's a sudden set of events associated with that. And then this might be kind of a punctuated equilibrium sort of situation where this is happening, and then there's a period of stasis where events occasionally otherwise happen, and then again things need to happen really quickly. And so AnyLogic will support that. You don't have to worry about putting everything into a once-a-month event that goes off, and you have to kind of handle everything that happened in the past month. From my experience, I've done quite a bit of work with systems like that, and it's quite awkward because you have to figure out which of these things which happened in the past month happened first, and if you want to record them, did the person die before they developed heart disease or vice versa, if we want to record the statistics right. And adjudicating those events is just not a lot of fun. And it's not natural. What is natural is you sort of have a continuous flow of time and things happen as frequently or infrequently as you want. And if there needs to be a flurry of sort of sudden things happening, that's no problem. It just happens. And that's the way AnyLogic works. It has these events that will fire off, and if they need to fire quickly, fine, they'll fire quickly. If they don't, they won't. So time in AnyLogic is continuous by default. It can be discrete if you so wish it to be. It may be, for anyone from background using, say, NetLogo or Repass, this might be an unfamiliar thing, but take it from someone who's been around the bush a couple times with using all those packages. It turns out to be more natural to think in continuous time. It requires less mechanism as a general rule. Yes. Yes.
However, I guess the time is one of the most important. Probably the single most important aspect of a lot of models.
Indeed. That's why they're called dynamic models. Yeah.
So I guess I'm a little confused about how we are sequencing, whether you call them events or occurrences. So if you think of something just as health, like health, you're healthy 1 year, healthy the next year, and then you get sick, that likelihood of getting sick depends on kind of prior events.
Absolutely.
As well as on outside facts. So it's Bayesian or whatever you want to think of.
There's dependence in these things, and you could capture it in a way that leverages Bayesian sort of characterization.
The question I have is, how do you recognize the fact that time is active, it's finite, So rather than calling it, I guess I'm getting confused by your term continuous.
Oh, by continuous, what I just mean is...
is everything happening at once? No.
No. By continuous, I mean, and it would help to learn a little bit more about your familiarity with other systems. But suffice it to say that in traditional agent-based modeling, when I started agent-based modeling 25 years ago, and wore a younger man's shoes, I the time component of models was always delineated in sort of fixed steps. Okay, so they're sometimes called ticks, steps, and they're a very important feature even today of a lot of these packages. And so, time would sort of hop forward, right? And the model would go from tick to tick to tick, and there'd be nothing that happens in between those ticks explicitly in the model. So those ticks, sometimes for a lot of stylized models, those ticks don't have a clear mapping to sort of familiar time, but often they do have a mapping. So we'll say they're once a month or weekly ticks, right? Or once a year. And during that tick, you've got to kind of often do bookkeeping on things which happened in the past year to accumulate statistics, to accumulate information about what's going on, record things, and to change things. So maybe, on each tick, an agent has a chance of dying, right? Each tick, an agent has a chance of developing a condition of some sort. Each tick, agents interact with each other. Tick, talk, tick. And that's how the model works. It's going from tick to talk to tick to tick, and so on. There's nothing terribly wrong with it, but things in the world don't tend to work that way, in the sense that we tend to live in a world where there are a lot of things which occur on a regular basis, and reporting is one of them. But there are a lot of cases where there are these episodes where there's a flurry of things happening, a fire hose of information being squirted at you at some boot camp, and then you go off and go to the beach and lay down and you're not. I hope you're not subjected by my lectures there. So the point is that sometimes we have these kind of periods where there's little going on and then sort of a flurry of things and little going on. And even within a month, say, certain things, if we consider a given month playing out, there are certain things that happen before other things. So either I, in a month, develop heart disease first, or I get married first. And how it is recorded that I got heart disease, whether it's heart disease for married men or heart disease for a single person, depends on which occurred first. And within any logic model, those would be events. Those might be transitions in a state charts, or that might be associated with a firing of some event, or it might be associated with some other type of change within the model. And the point is, one occurs before the other. It's very unambiguous which occurred first. Whereas if I'm going tick, talk, it's not. And I'm basically, for each of those ticks, I'm taking advantage of I'm computing all the things which have happened in the past month. I'm going to say, okay, did he get married this month? Yeah, he got married this month. Did he develop heart disease this month? Yes, he developed heart disease this month. Now, which I record, did he develop heart disease as a married as a married man or as a single man? That's something which often is not clear from that. And it turns out that if you go and you look at net logo models, for example, what you will find in the literature and in people's teaching of them is that the correctness of the model, sometimes it's correctness, sometimes it's just the behavior of the model, actually depends hugely upon which action you consider first during that tick. Do people first get considered whether they die or not, and if they die, they're off the shelf, and then we don't consider whether or not they got married? Or do you first consider whether they got married and record that in your statistics, and then only consider death? And you can imagine for a fairly rich model, I'll be with you in a bit, Scott, for a fairly rich model where you have lots of things going on, heart disease and smoking status change and people's deaths and babies being born or what have you, the ordering starts to become quite complex. And people who build these models will sometimes really, really sweat for long periods what order to handle these things in at that tick event because it matters. And if they handle it in the wrong way, it will lead to really bizarre results. If they handle it in the right way, it'll be more sensible. But it's not always obvious which is the right way. Now, there are ways to try to unpack it, but basically they involve a lot of mechanism. When I say continuous time, what I'm talking about is, the event in any logic goes off at some precise time. You develop heart disease at day 32, day 5.6 of that month. You get married at day 9.3 of that month. And therefore it's perfectly clear, which has occurred first. You don't have to worry about adjudicating it and switching the order and asking, is the model going to be subject to weird effects if one goes first? Because the ordering is the natural ordering. The ones that come first come first. Is that helpful? Yeah, Scott, you want to say something?
I think part of the confusion is one of terminology, because the system by which you pick, where you have your events beholden to a clock, the fixed, is actually called continuous time processing. That's a discrete time processing, which is what any logic uses. And the fact that discrete time processing allows you to have a continuous view of time, as if vice versa, is very confusing to a lot of people. And so it's very interesting to see how that.
Okay, I'd be cautious about that. I wouldn't call this discrete time processing. I'd call this discrete event processing. But there is, you're right, there is confusion. So these are what we call discrete events, in the sense that they occur as an instantaneous event at that time. We say someone developed heart disease at this time, at that time. As opposed to, a classic model where there's just these kind of ticks that span an entire month, occurring periodically, and they take care of all the things in the month. Here we have actually things firing off as frequently as needed as less needed. And I will say that within a system dynamics model, where someone has built, hundreds maybe now, of system dynamics models over the years, this is an awkward thing, because I remember building one model for a very high-level partnership with a nationality of a country I can't talk about for geopolitical reasons, and we would have long periods where we were just concerned about sort of events going on at a fairly regular rate and so on. We didn't need very fine time steps, but then we needed really fine time steps if there was a crisis of some sort. And we'd need really fine, like hourly resolution compared to, monthly resolution. And it was really awkward because there's a question, how fine do we have to run it? So broadly speaking, we had to run the model with time steps. This is not an any-logic model. It was a system dynamics model in Vensim, and we had to run it with time steps that were very, very small. Even though 99% of the time they weren't needed, we were just capturing those dynamics. And it felt like pounding a square peg into a round hole. And there are more sophisticated ways of doing it. And had I an academic group that I directed at the time, it probably would have created my own mechanism. But I was doing this as a consultant, and it was a very awkward situation. So choosing your ticks within one of these frameworks that just supports discrete kind of ticks can be awkward, and it is very natural to do these things in as fine-grained a fashion as possible. AnyLogic is not alone among packages in doing this. The ModGen package, which has been used by StatsCan extensively for decades now, and on which their POEM and LifePaths and other systems are built, is also a continuous time model, because they also find it so natural. So, Chris.
I just wanted to ask a follow-up question, which is going to the distributed random variables.
Yes.
Clearly, you can reflect those just by the structure of the model, right? You can reflect conditional dependence on
yes.
Yes. Line. So on. Can you specify them explicitly as well, rather than through some,
conditional decomposition?
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. So they can be very naturally expressed using conditional decomposition within AnyLogic. We have been on AnyLogic's case in a serious way about explicitly representing joint distributions between variables. And there's reason to believe that it might be rolled out at some point, but right now, to my knowledge, it's not even supported in 7.2. But generally, if you need, let's say, a joint distribution of income for across sex and age, you can turn it into conditional distributions. Conditional on someone's sex. You have a univariate distribution over age, and so you have univariate distribution of income by age for men, and univariate distribution for income of income for women, and you use those conditional univariate conditional decompositions to sort of characterize it, but it's not. It's a lot less pleasant than I would like, and we could engineer our own solution to that, but I think there's good reason to think that, this is on AnyLogic's list for health, because we've been advising these are the things you need to get for health, and they've been rolling out quite a number. I'm actually quite pleased where we're at in terms of providing support for things. AnyLogic 7.2 now has this bio browser that's apparently allows you to browse people's history according to the events that have happened to them and so on. That's something we support through our tools that Dylan could demo if you're interested. So you could diagram a person's history in terms of their episodes of care, or in terms of their periods where they had heart disease and this condition or that condition. But it is a thing that they've apparently captured now. They're adding more and more and more that is responsive to the health area, and this is one of them, joint distributions, that we have said, look, we really need these things. And I think it's going to happen sometime soon. I hope it will happen sooner. Jeff, any comment on that?
Oh, no, just to, if you want to look at the way AnyLogic handles time, I'd recommend Andre's book on the big book of simulation modeling. It's got quite a nice exposition of it. Yeah. And maybe this is just the time to say, because as Jeff tells me about these boot camps, the hardest part is figuring out the 90% you don't say, what 90% I leave out. And so, I have lectures on this issue of processing of events. And suffice it to say that AnyLogic as a tool, it jumps from event to event to event to handle them. So the next event that's going to be handled will jump forward to that. That event may be 3 seconds into the future because we're in the middle of a cardiac emergency, or it may be 3 months into the future because we're in a stasis of sorts. So in a punctuated equilibrium, it doesn't matter whether it's, in this period of great frenetic activity or stasis, in terms of it's just going from event to event. What's the next event to handle? And there's a lot of mechanism that links these up to the state charts behind the scenes and to these events, which can fire off, these triggers that can go off, messages, etc. And then there's removal of events from the schedule and stuff like that. But probably you don't want to know all the details of that, but suffice to say, just because you set your time, this is a very important point. If you set your model time unit as seconds, it will run no more slowly than if you set it as years. If events are only occurring once a year and you set the time unit as seconds, it will go no slower. It'll just jump to the next event. It's just many seconds between these, but it doesn't have to do anything in between those events. So whether you measure time in seconds or years, if the events are going off at fixed times that are independent of that classification, it'll run just as fine. So don't think because you don't think, you have to sweat it. If we set it to, the time unit to weeks, it's going to run a lot slower than if we set it to years. That's not at all the case. It is a matter of convenience, but it's a matter of being consistent about your conventions. Yes, go on.
I just wanted to back up a bit. You talking about how, Science is a very small tool set and ABM is a much bigger one. One major reason for that is historical, because systematics and algebraic modeling are much older in terms of methods and their use, and therefore they become more established. Everyone agrees, if you say system dynamics, people are going to expect two stock and resources, et cetera. When you say agent-based modeling, people understand you're going to talk about agents, but what that means and what tools you should be using to do agent-based modeling, as far as I know, has not really been fixed at this point.
No.
I was wondering, Dr. Hogan, if you could comment on whether you ever think that will be fixed, as in not fixed as in repaired, fixed as in.
Well, yeah, I see this as being the confluence. So your observations are, I think, a bang on. They're aligned with mine. System dynamics and discrete event modeling are quite codified now. And system dynamics as a community tends to be, regrettably from my perspective, sort of inwardly turned, and it's very centralized as a community. By contrast, agent-based modeling has been very much let a thousand flowers bloom and diverse parties pursuing it. Much of the tradition has been influenced by computer scientists at Los Alamos National Lab, at Santa Fe Institute. Also Michigan has been very dominant influence, but basically it's been very decentralized, and it's been sort of an open source community before there was open source. And so you just have very different ideas. But also, they're building their models. It is a more recent tradition. And one of the issues is in agent-based modeling, traditionally people wrote their models in code, and they create whatever constructs they wanted. And one of AnyLogic's big strengths is that something like a state chart is explicitly represented. There's plenty of models out there in NetLogo or in Repast that have higher level constructs in them, like a state chart, but just there's nothing that reifies it. There's nothing that recognizes it as a state chart. And as a result, it's merely implicit. You have to kind of read through the code to understand what's going on, and that there is this set of transitions in a state chart. And I think AnyLogic's one of its great strengths is sort of reifying these constructs. So you have state charts, you have events, you have stocks and flows. These are things that are explicit components. You have optionless, and this is the direction we've been pushing them, and it's aligned with the whole idea of having a declarative model. So do I think it's definitely going that direction for agent-based modeling. I mean, if you look at Repast now, they've been introducing state charts, and for good reason. From a software engineering perspective, it is sorely needed, and we can do so much better than AnyLogic and so much better than Repast with good software engineering principles in language design. AnyLogic's a lot better than others, but it could be a lot better. And as a computer scientist with a background in language design, we believe in my group and with my collaborators that we know how to make it quite a bit better. But you know, things have to change slowly, and you know, there's a matter of persuasion involved. But fundamentally, yes, agent-based model will be coming a long way, and it will be coming a long distance from the days where agent-based models were captured in opaque code that could not be shared in publication easily, and that had different conventions for different models. There will be movement towards a set of sort of building blocks that are clear. Will they be all codified building blocks? I have my doubts about that. There are two very different traditions seen in the agent-based landscape, one from computer scientists, one from economists in the form of microsimulation. Those two are combining in a very significant way now, and they have very different ways of representing models. So I think what AnyLogic has done is support a whole bunch of different elements of the vocabulary and let you choose which you want to put into play. If you want to use action charts, if you want to use state charts, if you want to use stocks and flows, if you want to use events and variables, you can put all those into place in your model, use your conventions. I don't think it's going to be codified as strongly as system dynamics has been or discrete event. I think for a long time it's going to be quite a bit more flexible and fluid than that. Okay, those are some comments on what we saw yesterday, and I tried to fill in some gaps on things. Any sort of comments or questions from that? Yes. Sure.
I guess one of the issues that I feel that, and I'm not sure maybe I just haven't found the right place yet. In a lot of other areas of epidemiology, we've come a long way in the last few years in developing standardized reporting practices. I'm not sure that I have seen yet a standardized way of reporting, especially agent-based models, so that they would be theoretically reproducible. I mean, obviously you could attach your model, but still, you know, in terms of how you talk about it, what components you need to talk about in your paper, in development of your model, those sorts of things. I'm not sure that I've seen that yet.
Yeah.
Is that there and I just can't find it, or is that really sort of been done?
There actually are now several contributions that seek to provide reporting guidelines for models. Lena and I have worked on a paper that's related to this and sort of good modeling practices, which includes some discussion of good reporting. There's also a paper by Hashir Rahmandad and John Sturman, which lays out sort of good reporting practices and I think modeling practices for models in the behavioral and social sciences. There's also a MDM panel that had a monograph on sort of good practices related to modeling, and I think had some on reporting. I would say we've come some distance on this, but I would say for agent-based modeling, it still remains a fairly weak a point of weakness. With a system dynamics model, one of the advantages is because it's amenable to this formal description, we can describe it in a page and or at least the equations, and then provide parameter tables. And often there's fewer moving parts, and therefore it's amenable to shorter description. With an agent-based model, there is this ODD, the overview, design, and details, plus sort of protocol that I'm fairly partial to, that's been advanced by Volker Grimm, and that provides some guidelines for systematic discussion of characterization of an agent-based model along certain breakdown categories. Jeff has followed the plus part of this a little bit better than I have, but I guess it remedied some shortcomings of the older standard. Jeff, do you want to comment on that at all?
Oh, yeah, it's ODD plus B. I think it's more or less.
Thank you.
I can post the rest if anyone needs.
Maybe post it to the community site. Yeah.
But it basically focuses on the decision, detailing the way the decisions are made. The plus B bit. And again, mostly the environmental science,
more than the submodel, so the way the decisions are made.
Well, I think that the original ODD protocol didn't have that much detail in the decisions associated with agents. So is that right, Jeff? Yeah. So if anyone's interested, I did have one of the references in the background materials that are on the site and in your binder, which provides a link to it's a citation to a book by Railsbeck and Grimm called Individual-Based and Agent-Based Modeling by Volker Grimm and Steve Railsbeck. And they're big net logo users, but the principles carry across whatever platform. And ODD, the ODD protocol came out of their work, and then they extended it with this. And let's put it this way: it's by no means the end of the story, but it's at least a step in the right direction. And there's no question that easy communicating and specifying these sort of models is very important for scientific communication and for scientific inquiry using these, building on top of these models. So it's an area that really needs a lot more work. I'm fortunate to be part of an IOM panel, an Institute of Medicine panel, which is looking at some of these issues in the States, and we'll be putting out a monograph in, I don't know, another year or two's time related to good modeling practices, and reporting will be an important part of that. So I'll be contributing. Ross Hammond, Elizabeth Brook, Hashir Rahmandad, others are also part of that panel. And it's a good group, and I expect that we'll have something substantive come out of that. So if you're interested, I would love to talk about this, and maybe we could make sure that you find it's responsive to your concerns. Okay, great. Any other questions? Okay, terrific. So that was a long retrospective, but hopefully a fruitful one.